Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. When a 24-year-old woman disappears without her dog, her car burns in a ditch, and her house smells like freshly melted candle wax, you don't call it a misunderstanding. You call it what it is, the beginning of a crime scene. In towns like Auburn, Alabama, where people leave their doors unlocked and wave from porches, this wasn't just another missing person. It was a rift in reality. Saturday, June 10th, 2006, started like any other summer day in Auburn. Lori Ann Slasinski had errands to run and plans to follow through. She was a recent graduate of Auburn University, known to friends and coworkers for being steady, thoughtful, and private. At 6:30 p.m., she left a voicemail for a friend saying she'd be dropping by after a quick stop at Walmart. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of distress, just another check-in. She never showed up. The following morning, calls to her phone went unanswered. That wasn't like her. On Monday, she failed to report to work at East Alabama Mental Health, a job she took seriously. No call, no explanation. Her boss reached out. Nothing. By Tuesday, when the phone remained off and no one had seen or heard from her, Lori's mother reported her missing. Officers were dispatched to Lori's trailer, a modest home nestled off North College Street. The property was quiet, too quiet. The front door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry. Inside, the lights were off, and Lori wasn't there. Her dog, Peanut, a tan mixed breed she considered family, was inside and clearly unattended. Food bowls untouched, no signs he'd been walked or fed. That, in itself, was alarming. Lori never left Peanut alone. Not overnight, not ever. A half-full can of Diet Coke sat on the armrest of the sofa. Her phone charger was still plugged into the wall. The television remote rested where it always did. There was no purse, no keys, and no immediate signs of a struggle. But a candle on the table had burned down to the wick and hardened over, the wax pooling slightly on the surface. It was a small detail, but details are how investigations start. Missing too were the hallway rug, a couple of sofa cushions, and an outdoor trash can that neighbors later said was always kept on the left side of the porch. The house didn't scream violence, but something was wrong. Officers noted the unusual absence of things that should have been there. It wasn't what was broken, it was what was quietly gone. Then came the break. At 3:45 p.m. on June 14th, a jogger called in a burned-out vehicle discovered on a remote dirt road off County Road 2 in Macon County. The SUV was completely destroyed. Its metal frame had collapsed inward, and everything flammable had been consumed. The VIN identified it as Lori's 2003 Mazda Tribute. There were no human remains inside. No wallet, no cell phone, no trace of Lori. Closer inspection of the scene revealed a red plastic gas can lying nearby. A lighter, partially melted, sat near the rear bumper. Forensic technicians confirmed what seemed obvious. The vehicle had been torched intentionally. The fire was fast, hot, and deliberate. There was no mechanical failure. Someone had tried to erase her. And then another item, small but potentially significant. Just off the shoulder of the road, 5 feet from the vehicle, lay a cigarette butt, unfiltered, half-smoked, still intact. Lori didn't smoke. Neither did her mother. None of her close friends recalled her ever picking up the habit. The cigarette was collected, bagged, and sent for DNA testing. It would take weeks to get results, but already it raised one unavoidable question. Who stood next to her burning car? The case was reclassified as criminal. The Auburn Police Department moved from wellness checks to full-scale investigation. Officers canvassed Lori's neighborhood again, but no one had seen her leave. Her last confirmed sighting was on Walmart's surveillance camera just before 7 p.m. on June 10th. After that, nothing. Detectives re-entered her home with more precise intention. This time they brought luminol. The interior had been left largely untouched since the initial welfare check. Now they were looking closer. Alternate light sources swept across floors, tabletops, and walls. Patterns on the carpet suggested furniture had been moved, but the surface yielded nothing significant. Whatever had happened, if it had happened there, was clean. They also gathered information on Lori's phone activity. Her last outgoing call was that 6:30 p.m. voicemail. Phone records showed no pings from cell towers after that night. Her social security number hadn't been used. No banks, no credit cards, no withdrawals. She hadn't just gone off the grid, she'd been pulled from it. At this point, the department opened a victimology profile. Lori had no known enemies, no history of depression or instability, no breakups, no threats, no patterns of isolation. But one name came up more than once. A longtime friend. Not a boyfriend. Not quite. Someone she had known for years. A man who had been spending more time around her trailer. A few neighbors said they'd seen him helping her with chores. One friend recalled a strange tone in his voice when Lori spoke about him at Christmas. He wanted something from her, she'd said, but I don't think she wanted it back. The friend was not publicly named, but internally investigators were narrowing the focus. They hadn't declared a suspect, not yet, but they had a person of interest. As of June 20th, the FBI flagged the case for priority review. No ransom note, no activity, no signs of voluntary disappearance. This was no longer a missing person case. It was criminal in nature, and whoever set that fire had done so with full knowledge they were covering up something much darker. Still, without a body, without blood, without a direct witness, prosecutors would have little to hold. The investigation had begun, but it would take years before the pieces were ready to connect. In the meantime, Lori's dog Peanut was picked up by her mother. The image of the dog sitting silently by the door, waiting for someone who wouldn't return, left its own kind of evidence. Not physical, but definitive. The scene was set: a burned car, a vanished woman, a dog left behind, and a house that smelled like wax. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a beginning. Auburn police re-entered Lori Slasinski's trailer 4 days after her mother reported her missing. The goal wasn't to look harder, it was to look smarter. With the burned vehicle now classified as arson and a cigarette butt under forensic review, the case was no longer operating under the assumption of voluntary disappearance. This was a presumptive homicide without a body, and the trailer was ground zero. Detectives began with a structural assessment of the living space. The front door showed no forced entry. All windows were intact. There were no signs of physical struggle, but physical signs aren't the only things that matter in a forensic search. In many cases, what's missing carries as much weight as what's left behind. That concept was the driving force behind what came next. Inside the trailer, the team cataloged each room again. Measurements were taken. Positions of furniture were mapped. This time, investigators had a baseline. They knew what should have been in that home. Photographs taken by Lori's mother earlier that year, simple snapshots from a birthday, showed a blue hall runner rug, a gray trash bin, and a patterned throw pillow on the love seat. All of those items were gone. The hallway rug in particular was critical. A full-length area runner, placed along the laminate flooring in the narrow hallway, was conspicuously absent. The floor beneath it showed no major scratches or stains. But there was a faint outline. Investigators noted pressure indentations where a heavy object had rested long-term and had recently been lifted. It wasn't conclusive, but it meant movement. It meant something had been disturbed. Next, they turned their attention to the kitchen trash can, missing entirely. The liner wasn't present either. It hadn't simply been taken out. It had been removed altogether. This wasn't routine cleaning. No one throws out the can itself. Given that potential biological evidence could have been deposited in that container post-incident, its absence triggered a forensic alert. Other details emerged under alternate light source, ALS examination. The bedding showed no blood. However, a trained technician observed a transfer stain on the lower right mattress seam, possibly soil or fluid, that was swabbed and sent to the state lab. A similar faint discoloration was found on the couch, armrest, but too degraded to determine without testing. Importantly, no cleaning chemicals were found on site. The absence of bleach or strong solvents suggested that if cleanup had occurred, it was executed without standard materials, or off-site entirely. During the walkthrough, officers also examined the bathroom. Nothing was out of place, but the shower curtain had been rehung inside out. According to Lori's mother, that was not how her daughter kept the bathroom. A minor deviation, but a deviation nonetheless. In crime scene investigation, subtle inconsistencies can sometimes signal staging or concealment. Meanwhile, the cigarette butt recovered near the vehicle was undergoing DNA extraction at the state lab. Given the fire damage at the scene, it was the only recoverable item from that location with forensic potential. Investigators were advised results could take 2 to 4 weeks due to lab backlog. Detectives requested Lori's laptop for analysis, but it wasn't in the trailer. According to bank records, Lori had recently made a payment to an electronics retailer, matching a transaction for a small laptop, but the device was never located during the search. Whether it was stolen, destroyed, or removed by someone close to her remained unknown. If someone had possession of it, and if it still contained recent emails or notes, it could reveal her state of mind or intentions. But in its absence, they were left to rely on third-party digital records. The forensic team submitted a formal report summarizing anomalies: 3 missing household items, rug, trash bin, laptop, staging indicators, candle burn-through, shower curtain orientation, and non-residential cigarette butt found at vehicle scene. No primary blood source, no body, no usable prints. But something didn't track: the timeline. Lori had spoken on voicemail at 6:30 p.m. Saturday. Surveillance showed her at Walmart minutes later. She was supposed to arrive at a friend's house that evening, but didn't. That gave a 2-hour window for disappearance and disposal. Investigators reviewed the Walmart surveillance. Lori is seen walking alone. She purchases toiletries and snack items, nothing out of the ordinary. She appears relaxed. No one follows her on camera. The receipt time confirms the call timestamp. Digital phone records supported the sequence. Her final signal pinged off a tower near her residence. That was the last verifiable location tied to her. No outgoing or incoming calls after 6:42 p.m. That silence spoke louder than anything else. At this stage, investigators turned inward. They began compiling behavioral profiles based on her circle. One name appeared in several reports: someone she had known for years, someone close but increasingly possessive. A neighbor noted his vehicle in the driveway a few days prior. A co-worker remembered Lori mentioning tension. A family friend recalled her saying she was being pressured. The name was not released publicly, but within the department, the tone shifted. A pattern was beginning to form. Cases like this often stall without a body. But Auburn PD began treating Lori's trailer as the epicenter, not the burned-out car. What happened didn't start in Macon County. It started in the home. From that point forward, every square inch of the trailer, every object missing, and every deviation from Lori's routine became evidence, not speculation. The lead investigator later said, "Nothing screamed homicide, it whispered it, quietly, persistently." The forensic timeline narrowed as the first laboratory results came in. What began as a general missing person investigation now hinged on recovered items with no direct witness, no confession, and no body. But science could speak in silence. The cigarette butt found near Lori Sosinski's burned SUV was the first item to return a usable DNA profile. The Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences extracted a male DNA sample. It was not a familial match. It was not degraded. It was viable and unique. The profile was loaded into CODIS, the national DNA database. No immediate hits. That result did 2 things. It ruled out Lori as the source, and it introduced an unknown male at the scene of vehicle destruction. The cigarette had been burned halfway, recent, not weathered, and discarded close enough to the vehicle that investigators included it in the radius of fire-related evidence. Lori did not smoke. No ashtrays were found in her trailer, car, or known social spaces. This single item positioned someone else in proximity to the arson. Auburn PD's evidence technician reviewed the placement of the gas can and lighter near the rear bumper. The melted plastic from the can had fused into the gravel, an indicator that the fire's origin point began at the back of the vehicle. The can's spout had been removed before ignition. The lighter's casing was half consumed, but its structure and components remained identifiable. Standard convenience store issue. No fingerprints had survived the heat. The fire itself showed signs of deliberate intensity. Accelerant was used heavily. The burn pattern moved quickly from the rear to the front. This wasn't a careless torching. It was methodical, fast, and complete. Nothing of evidentiary value remained in the interior except charred metal and wire skeletons. The license plate had melted from the screws but was still partially legible. The registration matched Lori's name. What stood out was not what investigators found. It was what they didn't. There were no personal items in the vehicle. No clothes, no bags, no electronics, no phone. Lori's digital footprint effectively ended the night of June 10th. There was no activity on her email, no access to her voicemail, no login to any accounts. Phone pings stopped at her residence. The next development came from the analysis of recovered soil samples beneath the burned SUV. Embedded in the ground were fragments of rubber and plastic not native to the car's standard parts. Lab review concluded the material was consistent with a rolled trash bin liner, a heavy-duty kind used for household disposal. While that alone wasn't proof of a crime, the implication was clear. Someone may have transported objects in a container that burned alongside the vehicle, even if it didn't fully survive the flames. Investigators had one working theory. Lori's vehicle was used to transport something, possibly her own body or evidence thereof, and was destroyed in a remote location. The missing hallway rug, the missing trash bin, and now burned bin remnants all lined up. It wasn't definitive, but the pattern was starting to hold. Detectives revisited statements from those close to Lori. Among the individuals questioned, one name, already internally flagged, began drawing more scrutiny. He had not offered an alibi for the critical time frame between 7 p.m. and midnight on June 10th. He claimed he had stayed home, but no one could verify his presence. There was no cell activity from his phone during that window. He also failed to mention contact with Lori that evening, despite phone records suggesting otherwise. This discrepancy prompted a request for a voluntary DNA swab. The individual initially declined, citing privacy concerns. Investigators recorded this refusal. No legal action was taken at the time, but the decision was logged into the chain of investigation. A pattern of obstruction, however soft, was beginning to surface. Meanwhile, the absence of Lori's laptop remained unsolved. Bank records confirmed she'd purchased one recently, but no device was located during the search. Investigators issued subpoenas to the electronics retailer for a serial number and potential IP logins. Results were pending. 2 new search warrants were drafted, one for a residence linked to the person of interest, another for his prior rental property. The property owner had given permission to inspect the crawl space after discovering odd bundles wrapped in insulation material. On site, officers recovered what appeared to be 3 carpet rolls, matted, stained, and sealed in black plastic. The carpet's pattern matched flooring previously documented in Lori's trailer, specifically the hallway. Forensic processing was immediate. 1 roll tested presumptive positive for blood. Swabs were submitted to the lab. A few days later, confirmation came. The blood matched Lori Slasinski's DNA profile. This was the first conclusive biological trace of Lori post-disappearance. There was no longer ambiguity about whether a crime had occurred. It had. What remained was the question of where Lori's body had gone, and whether anything had been transported in that rug before it was removed from the home. The investigation moved forward with a tightened focus. There was no longer a theoretical link between the trailer and the fire site. There was now physical proof of biological material in a location that should not have contained any trace of the victim. The rug, the cigarette, the bin liner, they weren't isolated anomalies. They were a chain. Within the task force, discussions shifted. The term homicide began replacing missing person. Search efforts expanded to areas beyond Macon County. Drones were deployed to survey wooded properties near the original fire location. Dogs were brought in for cadaver detection. There was still no body, but the pressure to find it was growing. So was the clock. Cases without a body are difficult. Prosecuting one without a confession or direct witness relies heavily on coherence. Each piece has to explain the next. That's where forensics matters more than motive. And in this case, the physical trail was becoming harder to dismiss. Behind the data, however, was a reality that couldn't be ignored. A young woman had vanished. She had a dog, a mother, a full-time job. She had groceries in the fridge and plans the night she disappeared. People don't vanish like that, not without someone helping them disappear, and someone had. By the 3rd week of June 2006, the Slasinski case was no longer viewed as a disappearance. Internally, Auburn investigators reclassified it as a homicide without a body. Externally, that label hadn't been made public. There was no indictment, no arrest. But every action behind closed doors had shifted. The recovered carpet stained with Lori's blood created the first undeniable link between her home and evidence of violence. From that moment forward, the investigation focused on locating what was missing, not just Lori, but any trace of her physical remains. The crawlspace rug discovery gave them physical evidence, but not a scene. No body, no murder weapon, no primary blood pool at the residence. Investigators began working backward to answer the only question that could matter now. If someone cleaned up, where did they take what they cleaned? The next strategy was geographic. Expand the grid around both Lori's trailer and the location where the burned vehicle had been found. A digital forensics analyst created a map overlay of known burn sites, remote dump zones, and rural access points within a 30-mile radius of both points. Any location reachable within a 2-hour window, corresponding with the night Lori disappeared, was flagged. Areas with limited surveillance and poor lighting were prioritized. It was during this sweep that cadaver dogs were deployed to several of those sites. One of them, a wooded slope off Wire Road in Lee County, triggered on a patch of disturbed earth near an old drainage culvert. The site was excavated. No body was recovered, but partial textile fibers were collected. They were compared to the carpet pattern and fiber composition recovered from the crawl space and matched in type and color. Not enough to prove disposal, but enough to suggest attempt. Meanwhile, investigators continued pressure on the unofficial suspect, who, while not named publicly, had already been flagged in several witness statements and whose inconsistencies had grown more difficult to explain. He was asked to provide a formal timeline of his activities on June 10, 2006. What he offered was vague. He said he had been home mostly, with no witnesses to verify. His vehicle, previously spotted in Lori's driveway by neighbors, had since been sold. Detectives confirmed the transfer occurred shortly after Lori's disappearance. This triggered a review of DMV records. A warrant allowed for forensic examination of the vehicle's resale photos, which had been posted to a local online classified site. One photo, showing the back of the vehicle, revealed faint but distinct discoloration in the rear cargo liner. Investigators traced the buyer, an out-of-state resident, and, after coordination with law enforcement in Virginia, recovered the vehicle. Forensics used Blue Star luminol on the interior. A presumptive blood trace lit the cargo area. Swabs were taken, and after lab analysis, a degraded but readable DNA profile was extracted. It matched Lori's. The result gave detectives another location, another transportation vector. Now they had Lori's blood not only on the discarded carpet, but inside a vehicle once owned by the individual, with the most unverified timeline. The link was no longer theoretical. Digital records filled in more gaps. The suspect's phone had gone inactive between 6:52 p.m. and 11:17 p.m. on June 10th. That window aligned almost precisely with the presumed time of transport and disposal. A background tower ping at 11:17 placed the phone in South Macon County, consistent with the location of the burned SUV. This convergence, physical evidence inside his former vehicle, unaccounted digital silence, matching tower location, and the removal of key household items, allowed investigators to build a movement model. Lori was likely killed or incapacitated at her home. The rug was used to move her body, the bin to conceal evidence. She was transported in his vehicle and likely burned with or near the SUV. But no body had surfaced. Despite this, there were legal limitations. Without a body, Alabama law required stronger forensic triangulation to support capital murder charges. The DA's office requested additional connective evidence. That led to a search warrant for the suspect's digital footprint, not just location data, but browser history, email accounts, deleted files, and USB activity. Data analysts found evidence that a portable USB drive had been connected to his home computer within 24 hours of Lori's disappearance. The drive had since been formatted. However, forensic recovery retrieved partial file names. Among them, lsl.lasinski.doc and witnesslist.xlsx. Both had been deleted. While the content of the files could not be fully restored, Metadata confirmed both had been accessed on June 11, 2006. Investigators documented this and secured forensic expert testimony regarding digital file timestamps and deletion patterns. What emerged was a growing narrative of premeditated erasure, an attempt to control what could be found before it could be asked for. On June 30th, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, issued a victim offender interaction profile. They concluded Lori likely knew her killer and had not been lured, but confronted. The scene suggested someone familiar, with enough access and confidence to remain post-crime, clean, and remove. The timeline of burn site selection, vehicle torching, and phone inactivity aligned with offender control, not panic. But despite growing evidence, the central question remained unanswered. Where was Lori? For the Selesinski family, the passing days blurred into a single, unresolved moment. They had blood, fiber, and pattern, but no remains. And in a legal system where juries are often hesitant to convict without a body, every missing hour mattered. The hardest part of a nobody case isn't proving someone died. It's proving someone made them disappear completely. By mid-July 2006, the investigation into Lori Selesinski's disappearance had reached a forensic threshold. There was blood, digital evidence, physical concealment, and a suspect with no verifiable alibi. What they didn't have yet was the ability to explain why. The how was building. But motive matters in trials, especially in no-body homicides. And it was motive that quietly surfaced through the suspect's history, buried, legally sealed, and almost overlooked. The man under scrutiny wasn't new to violence. Before moving to Alabama, he had spent most of his adolescence in Maryland. In 1993, at just 12 years old, he was charged with a double homicide, the killing of his mother and stepfather. According to archived juvenile court files, restricted but accessible through internal channels, he shot one and bludgeoned the other with a bat. When questioned back then, he told officers he'd just had enough. He was committed to a state juvenile facility and released after serving the maximum term allowed under youth sentencing guidelines. He changed his name not long after that release. By the time he arrived in Alabama in the early 2000s, he had legally reset his life. There was no public criminal record visible to employers, friends, or neighbors. Lori, based on all available statements, did not know about his past. This wasn't just a piece of background. It changed how investigators approached every decision he made in the current timeline. His refusal to provide DNA, his sudden sale of his vehicle, his reluctance to submit to questioning. These weren't random. They were learned behaviors. They were defensive measures developed by someone who had once succeeded in surviving the aftermath of murder. The Behavioral Analysis Unit noted patterns. He didn't overcorrect or show excessive grief. He didn't insert himself into the search or try to manage the narrative. He withdrew, minimized, and redirected, all consistent with prior concealment offenders. This wasn't amateur behavior. The legal team knew the 1993 homicides could not be entered as direct evidence in a future trial, but they could inform prosecutorial strategy and anticipate defense moves. The priority now was to secure enough modern forensic weight to overcome the absence of a body. In this phase, law enforcement obtained a warrant for forensic scans of the suspect's former residences, including one rented property he vacated weeks after Lori disappeared. Inside the utility shed behind the home, an evidence technician recovered a box of cleaning rags, latex gloves, and a single box of contractor bags, half empty. The gloves were unused. The rags were soiled. Some contained trace amounts of an oily red-brown substance. Chemical tests confirmed it wasn't rust, it wasn't paint, it was blood. The amount was not sufficient for DNA typing, but the technician documented that the cloths were stored in an area with no plumbing, no sink, and no signs of mechanical work. They had no practical business being in that location, unless they'd been used for a cleanup and intentionally hidden. This wasn't proof, but it added to the profile of control and staging. It was another layer of intent. At the same time, investigators reviewed the suspect's search history on a desktop hard drive previously seized. Among recently deleted files were queries related to gasoline combustion, melting points of car interiors, and how long does it take for a body to burn? Timestamps aligned with the night of June 10th and the early hours of June 11th. The district attorney reviewed the compiled evidence: location pings, blood evidence, digital forensics, witness testimony, vehicle transfer, deleted documents, and now a behavioral pattern stretching back over a decade. The case was building, even without a body, and yet without remains, the weight of proof had to be exact. The state couldn't afford a rush charge that fell apart under scrutiny. They needed one more direct forensic link, or a confession. But this suspect wasn't going to confess. For Lori's family, July passed with no funeral, no gravesite, no closure. Her mother had stopped saying the word missing. She didn't wear hope on her face anymore, just patience and insistence. For the investigative team, the case was entering a new phase. They had turned over the scene, tracked the car, mapped the digital footprint, and cracked open a sealed past. There was nothing accidental about Lori's disappearance. Someone had planned it, executed it, and buried more than just a body. By the fall of 2006, law enforcement had assembled what many agencies would call an atypical case file. No eyewitnesses, no weapon, and no body. But what they did have was substantial: layers of forensic evidence, digital footprints, behavioral analysis, in a suspect who had quietly rewritten his life after a juvenile double homicide. In Alabama, where the legal standard for capital murder requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, this case was now approaching prosecutable weight. The tipping point came not with a dramatic new discovery, but through the careful alignment of multiple, independently sourced findings. The DNA in the cargo area of the suspect's former vehicle, the blood-stained carpet recovered from a previous residence, the missing electronics, the scrubbed browser history, and the timing of it all, each element falling within the exact hours Lori Slasinski was last known to be alive. It was enough for the district attorney to move forward. A grand jury was convened under seal. The key question was not whether a crime had occurred, that was accepted internally, but whether the jury would accept a murder charge without a recovered body. Prosecutors presented a narrative constructed entirely from data: timeline reconstructions, forensic reports, lab photos, fiber matches, and the pattern of evasive behavior. It took 2 days. On October 18, 2006, a sealed indictment was filed charging the suspect with capital murder. The arrest warrant was issued the same day. The suspect, living in Virginia by then, was taken into custody by U.S. Marshals and held on fugitive charges pending extradition to Alabama. The public announcement followed. For nearly 4 months, Lori's family had received no formal updates. Now, with a single press conference, the nature of the case changed. Lori was no longer listed as missing. She was now legally presumed dead. The man arrested had not been formally named as a suspect before. When his identity was revealed, it was the first time the public connected his name with her disappearance. Reporters were not told about the blood evidence or the deleted files. Those details were sealed for trial. What they were told was this: the state believed Lori Slasinski was the victim of a homicide, and that the man arrested had the motive, opportunity, and means to carry it out. For the public, the story was breaking. For investigators, it was just the beginning of Phase 2. While the arrest marked progress, the real work shifted to trial preparation. Every item of evidence had to be re-verified, reprocessed, and rendered admissible under strict evidentiary rules. Forensic technicians reran DNA comparisons to confirm chain of custody. Digital forensic experts were scheduled to testify on metadata recovery. Behavioral analysts reviewed their notes to ensure every assessment could be backed by documentation. Lori's family, informed privately before the arrest was announced, declined most media requests. Her mother gave a single statement: "This doesn't bring her home, but it's a step toward accountability." The absence of a body remained the most difficult aspect. Prosecutors knew defense attorneys would focus on it. They would argue that without physical remains, death could not be conclusively proven. They would challenge forensic transfer, question the interpretation of digital data, and imply the possibility of voluntary disappearance, even in the face of silence, blood, and fire. To prepare, the prosecution brought in a veteran no-body homicide consultant. His assessment was blunt: you don't need a body when you can show the math of a crime. He meant that when every action has a trace, every deletion, every stain, every movement, you can add up intention without a corpse. The law allows for inference when the evidence is consistent, cumulative, and unbroken. But trials are about people, not just facts. Jurors want clarity, they want narrative, and they want closure. That's what made this case so difficult. Because even with an indictment and arrest, Lori Slasinski was still out there, unfound, unheard, and unrecovered. In September 2022, after 16 years of stalled progress, sealed records in shifting jurisdictions, State of Alabama versus Darrell, Richard Ennis was called to trial. The courtroom in Lee County was quiet when proceedings began. No cameras, no media panels, just a jury, 12 seats full, and one empty chair in the gallery, reserved by Lori Slasinski's mother, who had waited over a decade for this day. This case was not routine. The charge was capital murder, but the state had no weapon, no eyewitness, and no body. What it did have, according to the prosecution, was a layered sequence of forensic facts, digital anomalies, behavioral history, and deception that, when viewed in full, pointed clearly and solely to one individual. Opening statements reflected that divide. The prosecution laid out a timeline based on hard evidence. The last confirmed sighting of Lori, the missing rug and bin, the burned-out vehicle, the DNA recovered from the former suspect's car, and the recovered carpet containing her blood. No speculation. No theory beyond what could be proved. Their job was to establish that Lori Slasinski was dead and that Ennis was responsible. The defense didn't offer an alternative theory. They focused on gaps. No body, no time of death, no cause of death. They described the state's narrative as circumstantial layering, implying that every piece of evidence could be explained by coincidence, not intention. Ennis, they said, was being punished for his past, not proven acts. The state called its first wave of witnesses forensic specialists. A DNA analyst confirmed that the sample found in the rear of Ennis's old SUV matched Lori's profile. No transfer source could be identified beyond her physical body. A separate technician testified about the crawlspace carpet found in Ennis's former rental property, testing positive for Lori's blood. Both testified that the likelihood of error in those results was statistically negligible. Digital forensic experts followed. They walked jurors through phone activity logs. Lori's phone had gone dark at 6:42 p.m. on June 10, 2006. Ennis's phone remained idle for nearly 5 hours after. When it reactivated, it pinged near the location of the burned vehicle. An FBI analyst confirmed the location triangulation and provided heat maps of both devices overlaid with road routes. The jury was then shown screenshots recovered from Ennis's formatted hard drive, search terms for gasoline burn rate, body disposal methods, and how long human remains take to decompose. While not illegal, these queries were time-stamped within 24 hours of Lori's disappearance. Combined with metadata linking the suspect to documents referencing Lori by name, files since deleted, it became difficult to argue ignorance or irrelevance. The prosecution moved next to physical context. Photos of the trailer interior were shown. One image captured a candle burned down to wax, a discarded soda can, and an empty leash. It was the stillness that conveyed most. The absence of disruption, clean but wrong. The state suggested that someone had cleaned deliberately, that staging had occurred. Behavioral testimony followed. A former Auburn police officer recounted Ennis's original interview. Calm demeanor, no signs of concern, no proactive offers to assist the search. When asked to provide a DNA sample, he had refused. He sold his vehicle 2 weeks after Lori went missing. None of these facts were crimes, but taken together, they built profile. By day 10 of trial, the prosecution rested. The defense did not call Ennis to testify. Their only witness, a forensic consultant, challenged the chain of custody on the vehicle, implying contamination was possible during resale. Under cross-examination, he acknowledged no procedural errors were documented. The closing arguments underscored the core of the case. The state presented a timeline backed by recovered materials. The defense asked jurors to question what was not there. The jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. Guilty. Ennis was convicted of capital murder. Sentencing followed a week later. After consultation with Lori's family, the state declined to pursue the death penalty. He received life without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke only once directly to Ennis during sentencing. Some murders remove a person, yours removed a daughter, a friend, and any trace of where she now rests. And yet you left enough behind to speak for her. To date, Lori's remains have not been found. The verdict in Donnie Brantley's trial came after years of stalled investigations, cold leads, and a missing woman whose body was never found. In the eyes of the court and of the state of Tennessee, justice had finally been served. Donnie Brantley was found guilty of second-degree murder in the disappearance and presumed death of his wife, Marcia Brantley, more than a decade after she was last seen alive. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. There were no loud outbursts in the courtroom, no gasps, just quiet. A long, collective pause that said more than shouting ever could. Marcia's closest relatives nodded silently. A sister dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The prosecution team offered no celebration. They had built a case without the most vital piece of evidence, a body, and they had done it with facts, persistence, and a clear timeline of deliberate concealment. They knew this verdict mattered not just for this family, but for many others watching. The absence of Marcia's remains didn't mean the absence of proof. That was the message this case carried to its final chapter. The prosecution had leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. Financial records showing Donnie's sudden withdrawal of control over joint assets, evidence of Marcia's complete communication blackout, conflicting statements Donnie made to friends and family, and, most critically, a glaring lack of effort to report her missing. While the defense argued that Marcia simply left, the jury had seen through the silence, the contradictions, and the artificial calm of a man who had more concern for selling her belongings than finding his wife. The legal implications of this case resonated far beyond Bradley County. It became a reference point for no-body homicide prosecutions. Investigators from other jurisdictions followed the proceedings closely, aware that it demonstrated how a digital and behavioral footprint, if carefully documented, can replace the forensic certainty of a crime scene or autopsy. Bank statements, journal entries, phone records, and the abrupt severance of all social connections combined to form a mosaic of premeditation. In truth, it wasn't the absence of a body that left the strongest impression. It was the consistency of Donnie's avoidance and the unmistakable disappearance of a life that had once been fully intertwined with his. After sentencing, Donnie was transported directly to the state facility in Bledsoe County. He offered no final statement, no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. According to corrections officers, he remained quiet during intake, signing his name with the same steady hand he'd once used to cash Marcia's checks. Yet outside the courtroom, the silence didn't hold. Volunteers continued searching the wooded areas near the Brantley home, particularly around Rhea County, where Donnie had once spent time on family-owned land. Ground-penetrating radar teams and cadaver dogs were brought in months after the conviction, not because the law demanded it, but because closure for some still required a body. The community had adopted Marcia's story as its own. She had once been a local writer, an introvert who found comfort in animals and literature, and her erasure struck a nerve in a town that prides itself on being close-knit. Those who knew Marcia well reflected on the subtle warning signs. She had reportedly expressed concerns about her marriage to a few close friends. She mentioned isolation, financial stress, a sense of disappearing within her own home. But without bruises or police reports, her distress remained invisible. In hindsight, those quiet cues now screamed with urgency. The case underscored a painful truth. Disappearance doesn't always start with vanishing. It often begins long before, when voices are ignored, concerns are minimized, and warning signs are rationalized away. Marcia's story, like many others, revealed the cracks that form when emotional abuse hides behind a facade of normalcy. From a legal standpoint, this case also reminded prosecutors that time does not have to dull the weight of evidence. If anything, it highlighted the importance of persistence. Investigators re-examined the case several times over the years, reopening files, interviewing witnesses again, digging through old records. Without that diligence, this conviction would not have happened. Justice, delayed as it was, came because people refused to accept a silent ending. To this day, Marcia Brantley's body has never been recovered, and yet her name became louder in death than it ever was in life. The human cost of waiting for justice is rarely measured by time alone. It's measured in missed birthdays, unopened letters, unmarked graves, and questions that haunt rather than heal. In cases like this, justice is less about punishment and more about visibility, about saying clearly and irrevocably that this woman's life mattered. Donnie Brantley remains incarcerated. No appeals have reversed the conviction. The family, though fractured by years of not knowing, now has a legal truth to rest on, even if not the kind of closure they hope for. For the viewers who followed this story, who watched the slow, careful work of investigators and the agonizing patience of family members, we close with this. If someone you know disappears, don't assume silence is harmless. Silence can bury the truth. Silence can be a weapon, but silence, when challenged, can also be broken. In the end, what this case taught me, and maybe it'll mean something to you too, is that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence is a warning. Sometimes it's a scream no one hears. If you ever feel yourself fading from your own life, like Marcia did, don't wait to be found. Speak up, reach out, value your voice, and now I want to hear from you. What stood out to you most in this story? Have you ever known someone who simply disappeared from their world before anyone noticed? If this video moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, or just tell me where you're watching from. If you didn't enjoy the video, I'd still love to know why. Your feedback helps me grow. And hey, if this story touched something in you, don't scroll past. Hit subscribe and follow for more true stories that matter.